I was 17 years old when I decided to buy my first car. I had saved up just enough money from part-time jobs and was eager to find a decent ride. Like many young people back then, I turned to Craigslist, scrolling through endless listings of used cars. After weeks of searching, I found what seemed to be the perfect deal: a Honda Accord, low mileage and an unbeatable price. The seller, who went by the name Mark, was quick to respond to my inquiry. He claimed he was moving out of town and needed to sell the car urgently. It sounded plausible enough. When Mark asked if I could come to his house to see the car, I didn't think much of it. He provided an address in a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with, but it didn't seem particularly sketchy. I told my mom about it, and she was hesitant, but eventually agreed as long as I promised to text her the moment I got there. In hindsight, I wish I had listened to her gut feeling. When I arrived, the house was older, with chipped paint and overgrown bushes, but it didn't scream danger. Mark, a man in his late 30s with a friendly demeanor, greeted me at the door. "The car's in the garage," he said with a smile. I followed him inside, expecting to step right back out to see the car. Instead, he led me through a dimly lit living room filled with mismatched furniture and piles of newspapers. Something about the clutter made me uneasy. "Sorry about the mess," Mark said, noticing my glance. "I'm packing up to move." He motioned for me to follow him down a hallway. "The garage is this way." The hallway was narrow, lined with faded family photos. As we walked, I noticed an odd smell, a mix of mildew and something metallic. My gut churned, but I ignored it, convincing myself that I was overthinking things. Mark opened a door at the end of the hallway, revealing a staircase leading down to a basement. "The garage is through here," he said, motioning for me to go down first. That was when my alarm bells started ringing. Who keeps their garage in the basement? I hesitated, looking down the dark staircase. The only light came from a single bulb flickering at the bottom. "Actually, can we look at the car from outside?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark's smile faltered for a split second before he quickly recovered. "The driveway's blocked. It's easier to see it from here." My instinct screamed at me to leave. "You know what? I think I left my phone in the car," I lied. "Let me grab it real quick." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked back down the hallway. My heart pounded as I reached the front door, fumbling with the handle. Just as I stepped outside, I heard Mark's voice behind me. "Wait, where are you going?" I didn't answer. I sprinted to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I saw Mark standing on the porch, his friendly facade completely gone. His face was cold, almost angry. He stared at me as I sped away. Later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible would have happened if I'd gone down those stairs. A week later, I saw a news report about a man who had been arrested for luring people to his home through fake Craigslist ads. His mugshot flashed on the screen and my stomach dropped. It was Mark. The report detailed how he had a soundproof basement and had already attacked 2 other victims who weren't as lucky as me. To this day, I'm haunted by how close I came to becoming another statistic. Trust your instincts. They might save your life. There's a certain temptation that comes with the idea of finding something for free. For most, it's a quick fix or an unexpected bonus. For others, it's a trap. But for Dave, it was just the allure of a mini fridge. He wasn't expecting much, maybe just a small unit for the corner of his apartment. What he didn't expect was to encounter something that would change his perception of free forever. It all started when Dave came across a listing for a free mini fridge. He was scrolling through a local buy/sell group, looking for any random item that could make his life a little easier. A mini fridge was perfect, especially after his old one finally gave up on him. He was tired of squeezing his groceries into a tiny, aging cooler. He couldn't believe it when he saw the post. "Free mini fridge, works perfectly, just come pick it up." The listing had no contact number, but the name was listed as Sarah, and a vague location near the edge of town. Something about it felt off, but Dave brushed the feeling aside. He was just being paranoid, he told himself. It was a free fridge, for crying out loud. Just come by, let yourself in, the door's open, it's by the lake. The response was short and unnerving. Who would give out access like that? No directions, just a vague promise. Despite his reservations, Dave was intrigued. He checked the map, and sure enough, the house was near a lake, about a 20-minute drive from his apartment. Not too far. As Dave drove to the address, his unease grew. The closer he got to the house, the more his skin prickled. The road twisted through dense trees, and the dark waters of the lake stretched out beside him, almost surreal in the dimming daylight. The house was at the end of a long, narrow driveway, isolated from the rest of the world. It was beautiful, in an eerie, untouched way. A large two-story house with old stone walls and ivy creeping up the sides. The windows were dark, but lights flickered from inside, and the faint hum of an air conditioner could be heard. Summer reached for the radio, and the dial came to life. He parked in front, staring at the house for a moment. The door was slightly ajar, just as Sarah had said it would be. There were no signs of life, no cars in the driveway, no movement. It felt like the house had been waiting for him. He hesitated for a second, but eventually stepped out of the car, walking cautiously toward the door. The wood creaked under his shoes, and the silence around him was deafening. He knocked lightly, but when no answer came, he pushed the door open. It was unlocked, just like she said. Stepping inside, Dave was greeted by the smell of dust and aged wood. The entryway was grand, with tall vaulted ceilings and antique furniture scattered across the large open space. His footsteps echoed in the quiet house as he glanced around. It seemed strangely vacant. No sounds of life, no sounds at all except for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. He stepped further into the house, drawn to the back where he assumed the kitchen would be, and he knew as he walked, his eyes lingered on the photographs hanging on the walls. Old family portraits, most of them black and white, and a few color photos that seemed more recent. They all seemed off, though. The people in the pictures were too stiff, their eyes too intense, as if they were staring right through him. Finally, he reached the kitchen, and there it was, sitting in the corner, the mini fridge. It was a cheap, compact model, but it looked perfectly fine. It sat against the wall, almost waiting for him. It was clean, too clean, considering the rest of the house seemed untouched, like no one had lived here for a long time. He felt a sudden urge to leave, but the fridge beckoned him. He walked closer, examining the fridge. The door was slightly open, and through the crack he could see something dark inside. Maybe it was just the shadows from the dim lighting, but it almost looked like there was something or someone inside. His heartbeat quickened. He shook his head, trying to laugh off his growing discomfort. "Get it together, man," he muttered to himself. But when he opened the fridge door, there was nothing inside but a faint, unpleasant odor, something sour like old food left to rot. He shut the door quickly, his eyes darting around the room. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something was wrong. He wasn't supposed to be here, not like this. As Dave turned to leave, a faint noise stopped him. A soft, almost imperceptible sound that made his stomach drop. A rustling coming from the direction of the stairs. He froze, listening intently. It sounded like footsteps, but not human. The creaking of floorboards, the shifting of something large or heavy. He backed up toward the door, his pulse racing. He reached for the handle, but as his fingers brushed it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Dave jumped, his breath catching in his throat. He whipped around, searching for the source of the noise. His eyes met the top of the stairs, where a figure now stood in the doorway. It was silhouetted in the dim light, tall and unnaturally thin, its head tilted in a way that wasn't normal. It was too still, too quiet, as if it were waiting for him to make a move. Who are you?" Dave stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to descend the stairs, slowly, each step deliberate, each creak sending a chill down Dave's spine. The closer it came, the more he realized just how wrong it looked. Its face was pale, almost ashen, with eyes that were too wide, too vacant, as if there was nothing human left behind them. A feeling of dread washed over him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice shaking. No response. But the figure's eyes seemed to darken, and it moved closer, one slow step at a time. Dave's heart pounded. He was trapped. The front door was locked, the windows too high to reach. There was no escape. Just as the figure was about to reach him, Dave lunged for the fridge. He yanked it open, desperate for something, anything to break the tension. Inside, he found only darkness, but the smell had grown stronger, more putrid. He slammed the door shut again, horrified by the sensation that something had just brushed against his hand. Turning, he ran. He didn't care about the fridge anymore. He just needed to get out. His heart raced in his chest as he pounded on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response. No one could hear him. As he scrambled to the window, trying to break through, a cold breath at the back of his neck sent him into a panic. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He heard the sound of heavy breathing behind him, but when he turned, nothing was there. A voice, soft but chilling, whispered from the shadows, "You're not leaving. Not with my fridge." The door to the house opened behind him with a screech, but Dave was already gone, running toward the darkened road, the sound of footsteps following him just out of sight. He never went back to that house. Never again. So, if you ever come across a free mini-fridge in an isolated place, just know that some things are too good to be true, and sometimes the price you pay for something free is far more than you bargained for. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when my family decided to sell an old TV. It had been sitting in our garage for years, and my dad thought it was time to get rid of it. We listed it on Craigslist for $100, hoping for a quick sale. Within an hour, we got a response from someone named Jake, who seemed genuinely interested. He said he'd pick it up later that evening. When Jake arrived, he wasn't alone. 2 other men were with him, all dressed casually. They greeted us politely, and Jake immediately started asking about the TV. My dad wheeled it out, and Jake examined it closely. Everything seemed normal until Jake said, "You're sure it works, right?" "Absolutely," my dad replied. "We tested it this morning." Jake nodded, then glanced at his friends. That's when the atmosphere shifted. One of the men pulled out a gun and pointed it at my dad. "Step back," he ordered. My heart sank. My mom and I were frozen, standing just inside the garage. The men grabbed the TV and demanded my dad's wallet. "Please, just take the TV and go," my dad pleaded. The man with the gun laughed. "Not how this works." He motioned for my dad to hand over his wallet. Reluctantly, my dad complied. One of the other men noticed me and my mom. "You two, empty your pockets," he barked. Trembling, we did as we were told. They took everything, our phones, cash, even my mom's wedding ring. Before leaving, the gunman issued a chilling warning. "Don't call the cops or we'll be back." They drove off with the TV and all our belongings. We stood there in shock, unable to process what had just happened. My dad eventually called the police, despite the threat. When the officers arrived, they took our statements and assured us they'd do everything they could to catch the men. A week later, we got a call from the police. They had caught the suspects after a sting operation involving another Craigslist ad. It turned out these men had been targeting families selling items online, using the same method to rob them. While we got some of our belongings back, the experience left a permanent scar. Now, every time I see a Craigslist ad, I can't help but remember that night and how close we came to something much worse. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Emily and her boyfriend Jake had planned their winter camping trip for months. The two were seasoned hikers and loved the challenge of remote locations. This time, they chose a trail deep in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. The forecast predicted rain, but that only added to the allure. There was something magical about hiking under the misty canopy of trees. The first day of their trip went smoothly. The couple set up their tent near a secluded lake, the rain creating ripples on the water's surface. They cooked a warm meal over their portable stove, laughing and enjoying the tranquility. Emily even joked about writing a blog post titled, "How to Camp Like Pros in the Rain." As night fell, the rain picked up, and the forest grew eerily quiet. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She brushed it aside, chalking it up to nerves, and the couple retired to their tent. But just as she was drifting off, a faint whistle cut through the sound of the rain. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, nudging Jake awake. "Hear what?" Jake mumbled, still half asleep. "A whistle, like someone's out there." Jake listened for a moment, but the only sound was the rain hitting the tarp. "Probably just the wind," he said, rolling over. Emily wasn't convinced. The whistle had sounded deliberate, almost like a tune. She stayed awake for hours, straining to hear it again, but eventually, exhaustion overtook her. The next morning, they discovered something unsettling. The ground near their tent was disturbed, as if someone, or something, had been circling it during the night. Emily pointed it out, but Jake dismissed it as animal tracks. "We're in the woods," he said with a shrug. "It's probably just a deer." But Emily knew better. The prints were human, barefoot, and oddly spaced, as if whoever made them had been walking in long, deliberate strides. As they hiked further into the forest that day, Emily couldn't shake her unease. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the rain turned the ground into a slick, muddy mess. They passed no other hikers, which wasn't unusual given how remote the trail was, but Emily couldn't help feeling like they weren't alone. That evening, the whistling returned. It was faint at first, almost blending with the rain, but it grew louder as the night went on. Jake finally acknowledged it, his usual confidence replaced by unease. "That's not the wind," he admitted, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Stay in the tent. I'll go check it out." "Are you crazy?" Emily hissed. "You're not going out there." But Jake was already unzipping the tent. He stepped into the rain, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" The whistling stopped. Emily held her breath, straining to hear any sign of Jake. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last. Then came a blood-curdling scream. "Jake!" Emily bolted out of the tent, her own flashlight shaking in her hand. She followed the sound of his voice, her boots sinking into the mud with every step. The rain blurred her vision, but she finally found him, standing stock still, staring at something in the distance. "Hey, Big." "Jake, what's wrong?" she demanded, shaking his arm. He didn't respond. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on a point deep in the forest. Emily followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. There, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. Its face was pale and featureless, save for two glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "Run," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Jake's hand and pulled him back toward the tent. They didn't stop to pack up their gear, they just ran, slipping and stumbling through the mud, the sound of the whistling haunting their every step. When they finally reached their car, they were soaked, trembling, and too terrified to look back. As they sped away, Emily glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes the last thing she would ever see of that cursed place. Even now, Emily and Jake refused to talk about what they saw. Their camping gear was never recovered, and the area remains a place of nightmares in their memories.